On a Thursday morning in October 1978, in Howard County, Iowa, 72-year-old Earl Mercer stood beside a wooden fence and stared at the left side of his Holstein cow. 3 irregular golden patches had appeared beneath her shoulder. They were not dirt. They did not wash away. Earl rubbed one with a wet rag, then looked toward the north pasture. That pasture had belonged to his family since 1929. Earl knew every rise, every wet spot, every stone that could break a mower blade. He could not explain the markings. The cow belonged to him because nearly everything else did. His wife had died 6 years earlier. His only son, Daniel, worked maintenance in Cedar Rapids and came home when he could. Earl kept the farm going with a 1951 Farmel M that coughed blue smoke on cold mornings and a barn full of tools his father had taught him to use. That morning Earl opened the gate. The cow walked toward the north fence. Earl followed. He did not know that beneath an ordinary pasture tree, something buried for nearly 50 years was about to change the way 2 men understood the land. Let me tell you about Earl Mercer. He was not a famous farmer. Nobody had written his name in a county history book. He had never won a machinery contest, never owned a new tractor, and never appeared in a farm magazine. He simply knew his ground. For 49 years he had watched that Iowa soil change color after rain. He knew where water stood in April and where hay dried first in July. He could hear a bearing beginning to fail before another man could see the wobble. His Farmel M had been bought used in 1961 for $1,150 from a dealer in Decorah. The tractor made about 38 drawbar horsepower and weighed roughly 4,600 pounds without ballast. Earl's father called it a red mule. Earl called it reliable. He had rebuilt the carburetor twice, replaced the clutch once, and kept the original block because, as he put it, cast iron remembers how to work. By 1978, younger farmers laughed at the old machine. One of them was 38-year-old Calvin Reed, a successful machinery dealer from Cresco. Calvin drove a new Chevrolet pickup, wore polished boots, and sold John Deere 4020s to farmers who wanted more power, hydraulic capacity, and comfort. He believed in progress because progress had made him money. When Calvin visited Earl that October, he noticed the cow immediately. "Earl," he said, "you feeding that animal gold now?" 2 hired hands laughed. Earl looked at the spots. "No," he answered. "Something's feeding the gold." Calvin smiled. "What does that mean?" Earl pointed toward the north pasture. "The cow keeps going there." Calvin laughed again, louder this time. Not a cruel laugh. A confident one. That distinction mattered. He had come to inspect Earl's old Farmel M, because Earl needed a rear tire and Calvin thought the old farmer might finally be ready to trade. Instead, Calvin found him studying a cow. "Maybe she's eating mineral," Calvin said. "Maybe. Or maybe she's just dirty." "Maybe." Calvin shook his head. 49 years on this farm and you're chasing a spotted cow?" Earl rested both hands on the fence. "I'm not chasing her." "Then what are you doing?" "Watching." The answer made Calvin grin. But Earl had already noticed something Calvin hadn't. Every morning the cow walked to the same corner of the pasture. Every evening she returned from the same place. And the golden patches were appearing in the exact places where her wet hide brushed against something. The next morning Earl followed her. She crossed the grass, past a drainage ditch, and stopped beneath a tree Earl could not remember seeing before. It was enormous. An old bur oak, wide enough that Earl could not reach around the trunk. He stood beneath it. The branches were mostly bare. The ground was dry. And around the roots, the grass was dead in a perfect half circle. Earl crouched. His fingers touched the soil. Then he found something hard beneath it. Metal. He brushed away leaves. A narrow iron ring appeared. Earl pulled. Nothing. He pulled harder. The ring moved. Something beneath the earth groaned. He stopped. The cow stepped back. Earl stared at the roots. For the first time he realized there was a place on his own farm he had never known. He went back to the barn and brought the Farmel M. He hooked a length of chain to the iron ring. The tractor idled. The old engine settled into a deep, uneven rhythm. Earl eased the throttle forward. The chain tightened. The buried thing moved once. Then the ground cracked open. And beneath the roots, Earl saw a wooden door that had not been opened since 1931. Earl did not open it. Not yet. He shut off the tractor and sat on the drawbar for nearly 10 minutes, listening to the ticking of cooling metal. In the distance, a milk truck moved along the county road. Somewhere behind the barn, a rooster called too early. Have you ever known you were right when everyone in the room said you were wrong? That feeling is different from pride. Pride wants witnesses. Knowledge does not. Earl went inside, washed his hands, and opened the cedar chest where his father had kept old farm papers. The first document he found was dated May 17, 1931. It was a hand-drawn survey. At the top, in his father's handwriting, were 6 words. Tree marks the old water line. Earl read it twice. Then he looked toward the pasture. The tree was standing exactly where the drawing said it should be. But the survey showed something else. A narrow structure ran beneath the roots. And beside it was one word. Cooler. Earl folded the paper. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches. Whatever had been built there, his father had never told him about it. The wooden door was only 4 feet wide, but it had been framed with oak beams thick enough to survive another lifetime. Earl knelt beside it and cleared away dirt with a screwdriver. The iron ring had rusted, but the hinges still looked solid. Calvin arrived before noon. He had heard from one of Earl's neighbors that something had been uncovered in the pasture, and curiosity brought him back in his pickup. What did you find? Earl pointed. Calvin climbed over the fence. For once he did not laugh. The old tree stood above them like a watchman. Its trunk had grown around one corner of the buried structure, making the door invisible from the surface. That's not a root cellar, Calvin said. No. Then what is it? I don't know. Calvin crouched and scraped the dirt from the hinges. There could be an old cistern under here. Could be dangerous. That's why I haven't opened it. Calvin looked at Earl. The older man was wearing the same faded denim jacket he had worn for years. His boots were muddy. His hands were black beneath the fingernails. Yet there was nothing uncertain in his face. Let me tell you about the year 1931. Howard County farmers were living without easy margins. The Depression had begun to squeeze rural families, and cash could disappear faster than a good harvest could replace it. A farm was not merely land. It was a system of wells, sheds, barns, fences, root cellars, livestock, and machinery, all depending on one another. Earl's father, Thomas Mercer, had bought the farm in 1929 for $18,400. The number sounded enormous to Earl. Thomas had not paid for it alone. He had sold cattle, borrowed from a local bank, and traded labor with neighbors. The farm was carrying debt when the market collapsed. Farmers learned to save everything. A broken bolt, a length of baling wire, a worn horseshoe, a seed sack, and sometimes something more important. Calvin studied the old survey Earl had brought outside. Cooler, he said. That is what my father wrote. What was he cooling? Earl shook his head. Milk, maybe. Calvin stood. There were commercial cream stations all over this county. I know. Then why hide one underground? Earl looked at the cow. Maybe they weren't hiding milk. That sentence stayed with Calvin. They opened the door at 3 in the afternoon. The smell came first. Cold earth. Rotting wood. Old iron. Then Calvin lowered a lantern. Stone steps disappeared into darkness. Earl went first. At the bottom was a narrow chamber about 12 feet long. Shelves lined the walls. Most had collapsed. Rusted hooks hung from beams. There were wooden crates, a broken hand pump, and 3 large ceramic crocks. On one wall, someone had scratched dates. Calvin touched the first number. This was used for years. Earl nodded. Near the back wall sat a steel cabinet. Its door was locked. Calvin smiled. Now that's interesting. Earl found a pry bar. The cabinet opened with a metallic snap. Inside were notebooks, receipts, a folded newspaper, and a small tin box. Calvin picked up the newspaper. The date was February 14, 1931. The headline described collapsing farm prices. Beneath it, in faded pencil, Thomas Mercer had written, "Keep the seed dry. Keep the milk cold. Keep the land." Earl read the sentence silently. His father had died in 1967. He had never mentioned the chamber. Not once. Calvin looked at him. Maybe he forgot. No. You're sure? Earl folded the newspaper. My father forgot plenty. He never forgot the land. The cow began making noise above them. A low, impatient call. They climbed out. The golden spots were brighter than before. Calvin stared at them. Earl, what exactly is happening to that animal? I don't know. The technical explanation was simpler than the mystery. Golden coloration on an animal's hair can come from mineral-rich mud, plant pigments, or substances transferred from bark and soil. It does not automatically mean disease or poison. A cow rubbing against a tree can pick up material from its surface, especially if the bark contains natural compounds or old deposits. But this cow was not merely rubbing against the tree. She was licking it. And when Earl inspected the trunk, he found a narrow seam where the bark had split away. Inside the seam was a yellowish powder. Calvin rubbed a little between his fingers. That's not ordinary dirt. No. Could be mineral. Could be. Calvin looked at the buried chamber. For the first time his confidence began to crack. They returned to the barn before dark. Calvin inspected the Farmel M while Earl cleaned the cow's flank. Still selling that old tractor? Calvin asked. Earl smiled. Still trying to buy it? I'm serious. So am I. Calvin laughed. Then he saw Earl's expression. The laugh died. He understood that the tractor was not for sale. The next morning, Calvin brought a county soil specialist to the farm. The specialist examined the yellow powder. He found traces of iron oxide and other minerals common to Iowa soils, but one detail bothered him. The concentration was unusually high around the tree. He asked Earl whether the tree had always stood there. Earl said yes. The specialist asked whether the land had ever contained a spring, cistern, or buried drainage line. Earl showed him the 1931 survey. The specialist went silent. Then he pointed to a faded line beneath the word cooler. This isn't a cellar, he said. What is it? He tapped the paper. Looks like an old spring collection system. That evening Earl returned to the chamber alone. He opened the last notebook. The final entry was dated November 3, 1932. It contained only one sentence. The water is still warm beneath the tree and tomorrow I will move the engine. Earl quietly stared at the word engine. Then he looked down at the stone floor. Somewhere beneath him something made a faint metallic click. The click came again at sunrise. Earl heard it from the pasture. He shut off the Farmel M and listened. Click. Then silence. He climbed down, walked to the tree and placed his palm against the trunk. The bark was cool. The soil beneath it was warm. Calvin arrived with 2 men from the county conservation office. They carried notebooks, a hand auger, and the cautious expression of people who had stopped assuming the old farmer was mistaken. They drilled beside the chamber. At 22 inches the bit struck wood. At 30 inches it struck metal. At 40 inches water came up. Clear water. Not much. But enough to prove that Thomas Mercer had built something beneath the tree that still worked 47 years later. Calvin stared at the sample jar. How? Earl shrugged. Water finds a way. That answer irritated Calvin. He wanted diagrams, measurements, numbers. Earl had spent half a century learning that land sometimes gave answers before it gave explanations. Let me tell you about the Farmel M. When Earl bought it in 1961, the tractor was 12 years old. International Harvester had built the M from 1939 through 1952, and millions of farmers trusted its simple 4-cylinder engine because it could be repaired without a computer, a diagnostic scanner, or a dealer technician. Earl's tractor had roughly 38 horsepower at the drawbar. That number alone did not explain why he trusted it. Torque did. Horsepower tells you how quickly an engine can do work. Torque tells you how strongly it can turn the shaft. A tractor needs both, but when you're pulling a plow through heavy ground, torque is what keeps the engine from giving up when the load suddenly gets ugly. That is why an old tractor can sound slow and still pull hard. It is not magic. It is leverage, gearing, weight, and mechanical simplicity working together. Earl understood that without using the words. Calvin understood the words. That was the difference. The county men discovered that the buried system connected to a shallow spring beneath the pasture. A stone channel carried overflow toward the drainage ditch. But the yellow material around the tree still needed explanation. They sampled bark, soil, and water. The answer arrived 2 days later. The tree was drawing mineral-rich groundwater close to the surface. The exposed roots and split bark carried concentrated deposits. The cow had been licking the bark and rubbing against it, transferring the mineral residue to her coat. The golden spots were not a disease. They were a clue. Calvin read the report twice. Then he looked at Earl. You knew something was wrong. No. You knew something was different. Yes. That is not the same thing. No. Calvin smiled. For the first time he was learning Earl's language. The real discovery came after the conservation men mapped the old channel. It crossed the north pasture and continued beneath the barn. At the end of the line they found a buried iron pipe. Earl recognized the coupling. His father had used the same style of fittings on an old irrigation pump. But Howard County did not have much irrigation in 1931. So why had Thomas installed one? The answer was in the tin box. Inside was a receipt from September 18, 1932. It was for a small gasoline engine. 7 horsepower. Purchase price, $86. Manufacturer, Fairbanks-Morse. The receipt had been folded around a handwritten note. Pump water when the creek goes dry. Earl sat on the porch. He remembered the summer of 1932. His father had once told him that the family almost lost the farm that year. Earl had been 26. He had forgotten the details. The drought had dried the creek. The spring beneath the tree had kept producing water. Thomas had used the Fairbanks-Morse engine to pump it into troughs and garden channels. That water had kept the cattle alive. It had kept the vegetable garden alive. And according to the old notebook, it had allowed Thomas to trade vegetables and cream for feed when cash was nearly gone. The machine was there, buried behind a collapsed wall. Calvin insisted they recover it. They found the engine covered in waxed cloth. The cast iron was brown with rust. The flywheel was frozen. The fuel tank was empty. Calvin laughed. Not the polite laugh from before. A genuine laugh. "You're telling me your father buried a 40-year-old engine under a tree, and now you think we're going to start it?" Earl looked at him. Several county men were standing nearby. One of them smiled. Calvin laughed harder. "Earl, that thing probably hasn't moved since Roosevelt was president." Earl wiped grease from his thumb. "Engines don't care who the president is." The men laughed. Earl did not. He asked Calvin for a wrench. Calvin handed him one. They worked until sunset. The carburetor was cleaned. The spark plug was replaced. The oil was drained and changed. A new belt was fitted from an old supply bin. The Fairbanks-Morse engine had a compression release and a heavy flywheel. It was built to start slowly. Earl pulled the cord. Nothing. Again. Nothing. Calvin shook his head. "It's finished." Earl tried once more. The flywheel moved. 1 inch. Then 2. Then the engine coughed. Everyone froze. Another cough followed. Then a hard metallic pulse rolled through the chamber. The old engine had not started. But it had moved under its own compression. And then the water beneath the tree began rising faster. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless? Maybe it was a tool, an old truck, a watch from your father, or machinery nobody wanted. The value of an old thing is not always what it can sell for. Sometimes the value is the proof it carries. Earl understood that. Calvin was beginning to. And when the old engine coughed again, Calvin stopped. He leaned closer. The rust had finally broken loose. Something inside the old machine was coming back to life. The water rose another inch. Earl shut the valve. Nobody spoke. Then the old Fairbanks-Morse engine caught. What? Twice. And finally it settled into a slow, heavy rhythm. The sound was not beautiful. It was better than beautiful. It was familiar. Earl closed his eyes. For a moment, he was 26 again, standing beside his father in the drought of 1932, listening to the same kind of engine turn water into survival. Calvin looked at him. "Your father saved this farm with that thing." Earl nodded. "He tried." "No," Calvin said. "He did." The old farmer looked toward the pasture. The cow was standing beneath the oak. Her golden spots were already fading. The mystery was over. But the meaning of it was just beginning. The county conservation office restored the spring channel and documented the old water system. They found no treasure, no secret mineral fortune, and no miracle hidden under the tree. They found something better. A working piece of farm engineering built by a man who knew his land well enough to prepare for a disaster nobody could see coming. Calvin changed after that. He still sold new machinery. He still believed in horsepower, hydraulics, and modern equipment. But he stopped calling old machines worthless. When an elderly farmer came into his dealership asking for parts for a Farmel M, Calvin no longer smiled. He found the parts. Sometimes he charged less. Sometimes he stayed late. And if somebody laughed, Calvin would say, "You don't know what that machine has already done. Let me tell you about what happened 5 years later." In 1983, Earl was 77. His knees hurt in cold weather. His hands were slower. He had finally let Daniel take over most of the heavy field work. But Earl still climbed onto the Farmel M every spring. The tractor pulled a small disc harrow across the north field. The old engine smoked. The tires were mismatched. The paint had faded. It still worked. Daniel wanted to repaint it. Earl refused. "Leave the scratches," he said. "Why?" "Those are receipts." Daniel laughed. The oak tree remained too. The spring ran quietly beneath it. The cow that started the whole mystery was long gone by then. Her daughter, however, had stayed in the herd, and the family kept a photograph of the original animal in the farmhouse kitchen. Calvin visited every October. He would bring coffee and sit with Earl on the porch. They rarely talked about the tree anymore. They talked about weather, prices, machinery, the things farmers always talk about when they do not need to explain themselves. In March 1986, Earl died peacefully in his sleep. He He was 80 years old. There was no dramatic ending. No final speech. Just a quiet farm morning, frost on the grass, and an empty chair beside the kitchen window. Daniel buried him in the family cemetery outside Cresco. At the funeral, Calvin stood near the back. When people had finished speaking, he walked to Daniel and handed him a small envelope. Inside was the original $86 Fairbanks-Morse receipt. "I think your father should have this." Daniel looked at it. "Where did you get it?" "Your dad gave it to me years ago." Daniel frowned. "He never told me." Calvin smiled. "Your father didn't tell many people anything." 10 years passed. The Farmel M stayed on the farm. By 1996, Daniel's daughter, Rebecca, was running cattle on the same pasture. She had grown up hearing about the golden-spotted cow, the hidden chamber, and the engine beneath the oak. One summer, she found the old Fairbanks-Morse sitting on a workbench. She cleaned it, rebuilt the carburetor, painted nothing, and started it. The engine ran again. Calvin was there. He was 56 now, his hair gray, his dealership sold to his son. He listened to the old engine and smiled. "Earl would like that." Rebecca nodded. "He'd probably say I should leave it alone." Calvin laughed. "He would." Then Rebecca asked the question he had been carrying for years. "Why did you laugh at him that day?" Calvin looked toward the oak. "Because I thought knowing something meant having the right answer." He paused. "Your grandfather taught me it can mean knowing the right question." In the years that followed, the story became local memory. There was no newspaper headline about buried gold. No television crew arrived. No museum put the tree behind a rope. Earl wanted it that way. The farm kept producing corn and hay. The pasture changed. A fence was replaced. The drainage ditch was cleaned. The oak lost a large limb during an ice storm in February 1994, but the trunk survived. Daniel kept the old survey. Rebecca kept the receipt. Calvin kept the lesson. And the machine kept waiting for somebody to need it again. The Fairbanks-Morse engine became a link between 3 generations, between a drought forgotten and a farm that survived because somebody had prepared for it. Visitors asked Rebecca why she never painted it. She gave Earl's answer. "Leave the scratches." That was the lesson hidden under the tree. Not that old machinery is always better. Not that modern technology is wrong. And not that every strange thing in a pasture is a miracle. The lesson was simpler. Pay attention. The land keeps records. Machines keep memories. And people who work quietly often notice what everyone else is too busy laughing to see. Some things don't become obsolete. They simply wait for someone patient enough to understand why they were built. If you knew a farmer like Earl, or if you have ever owned an old machine that everyone else called worthless, tell me about it in the comments. I read these stories because they belong to more than one family. And if you want another quiet mystery from the farms of the American Midwest, the next story follows a forgotten tractor that sat behind a barn for 27 years, until one mechanic finally opened its hood and found something nobody expected.